22 years ago, a hurried letter tore apart two young lovers between London and Ghana. He became a lonely billionaire in Europe, while she turned into a resilient single mother in a wheelchair in an African village. But when a young woman walked into a luxurious London office bearing the same eyes as the woman he once loved, the wheel of destiny turned once more. This is not only a story of love rediscovered through time, but also proof that prejudice, distance, and hardship cannot defeat a faithful heart. And sometimes, family is never truly lost, it is only waiting to be found. London, a bleak winter morning. Heavy grey clouds hung low over the sky, pressing down on the glass towers of the City of London. In the spacious office on the 39th floor of Cavendish Holdings, Edward Cavendish sat alone behind an oak desk, flipping absent-mindedly through a job application he hadn't read past the third line. Edward was regarded as one of Britain's most successful businesspeople at 43. From nothing, he had built Cavendish Holdings into a powerful finance and real estate conglomerate with a presence in nearly every major European city. People admired his decisiveness and razor-sharp instincts. But because of that, few noticed the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes or the prematurely grey hair marks of 2 decades spent living for nothing but work, numbers, board meetings, and contracts worth billions. This morning, he had several interviews for the executive assistant position. For years, Edward had taken no part in mid-level hiring, but when his longtime assistant, Margaret Doyle, suggested that this role would work closely beside him, he reluctantly agreed. "Half an hour, and then you can get back to the Q4 earnings report," Margaret had said. Edward had shrugged and accepted. All morning, young faces had paraded in one after another, some men, some women, all neatly dressed, carrying thick CVs and rehearsed answers. "My career objective is, I'm always ready to work under pressure. I believe I can contribute value to the company." It all blended into a familiar soundtrack, polished to meaninglessness. Edward smiled and nodded, but his mind wandered toward the shareholder meeting later that afternoon, until the heavy wooden door opened, and Margaret announced, "Mr. Cavendish, your 11:30 candidate, Grace Mensah." The unfamiliar surname made him look up, half a beat slower than usual. Mensah. The syllables tugged at something buried deep in memory. Before he could think further, the young woman entered. Grace wore a navy blazer, frayed at the cuffs, with a plain office skirt. Her leather shoes were carefully polished, but clearly inexpensive. Nothing about her appearance was flashy, nor did she try to disguise her modest background. Yet the way she walked back straight, slow but steady, radiated an unusual confidence. Edward opened his mouth to deliver the standard greeting, but the words died in his throat when his eyes met her face. Deep brown eyes, catching glints of gold in the light. Long lashes cast shadows on delicate cheekbones, a shy but genuine smile, and the slight tilt of her head in greeting. It was like a blade slicing through 22 years, carrying him back to King's College London in his 20s. "God," Edward whispered, his hand trembling so violently that the file slipped from his desk, papers fluttering down like wounded birds. The woman he had once loved with all his heart and lost on a summer morning in London, Mensah, and the young woman standing before him now no more than 22, resembled Amma so uncannily it hurt to believe. Grace frowned slightly, concerned. "Mr. Cavendish, are you all right?" Her voice carried a faint lilt, echoing the Ghanaian cadence. Edward stammered, I'm fine. Please, have a seat." He drew a deep breath, struggling for composure. "Impossible. Amma must be 40 by now. This is only a coincidence," he told himself, though his racing heartbeat betrayed him. Grace sat in the leather chair, fingers interlaced in her lap, gaze steady. "I know my resume doesn't have much experience. I just graduated from the University of Westminster with a degree in business management. But I can work harder than anyone. I really need this job. For my mother." Her voice caught on the last word, though she quickly steadied herself. "She's very ill, and the medical costs are overwhelming. I'll do anything." Edward's chest tightened, not only in her story, but in how she said times, mother times, with the same heavy stress on the first syllable that Amma once had when speaking of family. He asked cautiously, "Your mother, where is she now?" She's in Ghana. I was born there, but moved to England when I was 3. My mother raised me alone, working any job she could from hotel housekeeping to restaurant shifts. She sacrificed everything so I could have a proper education. Now it's my turn to care for her." Edward froze. Ghana. Amma had left him with the words, "My mother is dying back home. Please wait for me. I'll return." The letter still lay in his desk drawer, but she had vanished forever. He looked at Grace, her eyes, her voice, her gestures, every fragment of memory locked into place with a shudder. If Amma had been pregnant when she left London, then Grace might be— "Mr. Cavendish?" Grace's tone was anxious. "You look pale." Edward forced a smile and shook his head. "No, I'm fine. You remind me of someone I used to know." "Someone you used to know?" Grace smiled lightly, trying to ease the tension. "People often say I have one of those familiar faces." "No, not just familiar," Edward thought. "You are," but he dared not say it aloud. He shifted the conversation. "Miss Mensah, I'll be frank. I believe you have potential. This role demands intense work. Would you be ready to start next week if I give you the opportunity?" Grace's eyes lit up. "I can start today if you need me to." At that moment, Edward saw the courage and fierce determination that Amma had once shown when she spoke of building a business in Ghana. He nodded. Then, "Welcome to Cavendish Holdings." Grace blinked, stunned. "But we haven't even discussed salary or job description." "Executive assistant, 55,000 starting, full health insurance, and I'll advance you enough to cover your mother's hospital bills." Grace gasped. "Sir, you really don't have to. This isn't charity. You'll work harder than anyone here. I believe you can." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She rose and extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Cavendish. I won't let you down." Edward clasped her hand. The firm grip, the warmth of her skin, and a surge of electricity shot straight through his heart. He felt like he was touching the past, a lost soul fragment. When the door closed behind Grace, Edward stood before the glass wall, gazing down at the sprawl of London, the traffic on the Thames bridges no more than insects from this height. For years, he had believed he possessed everything: wealth, power, respect. Yet in a single instant, it all seemed hollow compared to the possibility that she might be his daughter. Margaret Doyle entered, handing him a cup of tea. She studied his uncharacteristically shaken expression, frowning slightly. "Mr. Cavendish, you hired that girl without reviewing her file or testing her skills, and the salary you offered is unusually high." Edward turned, his voice low. "Margaret, I need you to do something, completely confidential." "Yes?" "Seer, investigate everything about Grace Mensah. Birth records, family, schools, medical history, everything." Margaret paused, then nodded. "This has something to do with someone from your past." Edward opened a drawer and took out a small, time-worn wooden box. Inside lay an old letter, yellowed with age, penned in Amma's delicate handwriting. He handed it to Margaret. She read it, her eyes widening. "My God, Amma Mensah, you think Grace might—" Edward stared into the distance, his voice hoarse. "I don't dare be certain, but I have to know." He turned to the window, his reflection merging with the glowing city lights. A silent prayer rose in his chest, one he had never spoken aloud in all these years. "Please let her be my daughter. Please let this be my chance to make it right." Autumn 2002. London was awash with golden leaves and chilly winds. Students poured back into lecture halls, and King's College London buzzed again after the long summer break. Edward Cavendish, then 21, was in his final year of economics and management. His life seemed already mapped out. After graduation, he would pursue an MBA at Oxford and then take on part of the family business. His girlfriend, Charlotte Whitmore, the blonde heiress of a well-connected family, was considered the perfect choice for a lifelong partner. Everything appeared straight, predictable, neatly within the mold. One October morning, when he stepped into international business ethics, Edward's world began to shift. The lecture hall was bright, rows of wooden seats fanning upward. Students chatted idly until Professor Morrison entered, followed by a petite young woman. She wore a simple yellow dress, the kind that looked handmade. Her hair was neatly braided into long plaits that gleamed under the lights. "Class," the professor announced that we welcome a new exchange student from Ghana today. "This is Mensah. She will be joining us for the term." Amma gave a shy smile, clutching a worn notebook to her chest. She chose a seat in the third row, just a few spaces from Edward. From that moment on, Edward hardly heard another word of the lecture. When Amma raised her hand to speak about West African economic development, her voice was low and melodious, like music. The room fell silent until a few chuckles broke out. "God, her accent is adorable," whispered a curly-haired girl. "Where exactly is Ghana?" "Africa, right?" A boy snickered. "Do people live in huts there?" Amma kept her polite smile, but her reply was firm. "Ghana has modern cities, universities, and hospitals. We don't live in huts." Yet Edward caught the shadow of hurt flicker in her eyes. Curious students swarmed Amma when class ended with thoughtless questions. "Are there lions on the streets? Do girls really carry water on their heads every day?" She answered patiently, though her face tightened with strain. Edward couldn't bear it. He stepped forward, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Ghana is one of Africa's fastest-growing economies, rich in gold and oil. If any of you read the news instead of watching charity ads on TV, you'd know that." The crowd fell silent, embarrassed, before drifting away. Amma turned to him, her smile this time one of genuine relief. "Thank you." "No need for thanks," Edward shrugged. "But would you like to grab a coffee? I'd really like to hear more about Ghana." Amma hesitated, then nodded. They sat in a small cafe across from campus, its glass fogged with condensation, tables worn with age. Amma still clutched her notebook, hands trembling slightly. "I've only been here 2 weeks. Everything feels so different," she admitted. "Back in Ghana, I was among the top students. Here, sometimes I feel like I'm nobody." Edward shook his head. "Your answer in class today was brilliant. Most of them didn't understand international economics half as well as you do." Amma gave a soft laugh, the first flicker of confidence. Then she told him her father had died when she was 12. Her mother had raised her alone, working tirelessly to save enough for her to study abroad. "My mother believes knowledge is the one thing no one can take away," Amma said, her eyes glowing. "I want to study management to start a small business back home, create jobs for women in villages. They can weave cloth, farm, but have no market access." Edward listened intently, drawn by admiration and something deeper he couldn't yet name. In the following weeks, Edward found every excuse to be near Amma, inviting her into study groups, walking her to the library, strolling along the Thames. She always carried her notebook, filled with ideas for businesses in Ghana. One morning, catching up to her on campus, he asked, "Do you always walk alone?" "Usually." Amma shrugged. "I'm used to it. Not many people want to be friends with the girl from Africa." Anger flared in Edward, though he only said, "Then walk with me." From then on, Amma was never alone. Charlotte, Edward's longtime girlfriend, was displeased. "You're spending far too much time with that girl," she said with a cutting tone. "What's so interesting about a poor international student?" Edward's reply was curt. "Charlotte, we're done." The relationship carefully arranged by both families ended with a single sentence. Edward didn't regret it. For him, Amma was the light. Winter settled over London. They studied late together in the library, shared dreams, whispered fears. Amma spoke of childhood nights when the village sat around oil lamps during blackouts. Edward spoke of the burden of inheriting a business empire, of longing to escape the gilded cage. Love blossomed quietly, then blazed. One snowy night, they stayed in Edward's dorm room. Outside, snow swirled thick and white. Inside, only the soft glow of a lamp. Their first kiss was trembling, fervent. "We're too different," Amma whispered. "I'll only be here for a year. Then I must return to Ghana." "I don't care." Edward pressed his lips to her forehead. "We'll find a way. I can go to Ghana, or you can stay here as long as we're together." That night, they belonged to each other. But happiness was fragile. Only months later, Amma received word that her mother was gravely ill. Panic-stricken, she needed to return to Ghana at once. Edward clutched her hand, desperate. "I'll come with you." "No, Edward." Amma shook her head, tears streaming. "You have school, a future. I'll only be gone a short while. I'll come back." She left a letter. "Wait for me. I love you." And then she was gone. Edward rushed to her dorm, but the room was empty. He contacted the international office, the embassy, and hired a private investigator. But there was so little information. Ghana felt impossibly distant, and the internet in those days was too limited. Amma seemed to have vanished from the earth. For years afterward, Edward kept searching, but silence was all he found. Yet in his heart, Amma never left an unhealed wound, forever aching. Summer 2003. London basked in golden sunlight, but for Edward Cavendish, those days would forever be stained with grey. That morning began like any other. He woke in his small dorm room at King's College, turned to the side, and found only a cold space. The sheets still bore the faint crease where Amma had lain the night before, but she was gone. His heart clenched momentarily, but he thought perhaps she had risen early for the library. Amma often did up before dawn to take notes. But when he sat up, he saw a folded letter on the pillow, the handwriting achingly familiar, lines trembling. "My Edward, I'm sorry for leaving while you slept. I don't dare to look you in the eyes and say goodbye. My mother is dying. I must return to Ghana immediately. Please believe me, I will come back. I love you more than anything, and that love will guide me back to you. Please wait for me. Amma." Edward read it again and again, his heart pounding like a drum. He bolted from the room, sprinting down the corridor and across the dorm courtyard. But Amma was already gone. Her room was empty, her wardrobe cleared, leaving no trace but the letter. Panicked, he rushed to the international student office. The reply was cold. "Miss Mensah left the UK this morning. Flight to Accra. Please, give me her address in Ghana," Edward pleaded. "I'm sorry. We cannot disclose personal information." He ran to Heathrow, but the plane was long gone. In the days that followed, Edward called everywhere: the Ghanaian embassy, African student associations, and airlines. He sent handwritten letters to the only address Amma had ever mentioned, a small village near Accra. Silence answered. Months passed. Then years. Amma never returned, never replied. In a small rented flat on London's outskirts, Edward kept that letter. Each night he read it, clinging to its promise. "Wait for me," she had written. And he waited. He turned down countless chances at romance and refused the blind dates friends arranged. To him, Amma had never vanished. She had only stepped away. But time eroded his hope. By 2005, as he began his MBA at Oxford, Edward still carried the letter in his wallet. Sometimes, seeing the silhouette of a brown-skinned girl in the street, his heart would leap, mistaking her for Amma. Hearing someone speak with an African lilt, he would pause, pulse quickening. But always, it was only an illusion. The longing hardened into a scar, and like all scars, it never disappeared, only buried itself under new layers of life. In the years that followed, Edward drowned himself in work. He built Cavendish Holdings, ceaselessly investing, acquiring, and merging. Money poured in like a flood, reputation close behind. The press called him London's young financial prodigy. Outwardly, he was the picture of success. But in the stillness of night, when the office lights were dark, he sat alone with a glass of whiskey and the old letter. Everything he had achieved felt hollow without Amma beside him. He even tried to build another family. In 2009, he married Charlotte, his former girlfriend from years before. Their families rejoiced at the class-appropriate union. But love cannot be forced. Edward never stopped whispering Amma's name in his sleep for 8 years of marriage. Charlotte knew. The marriage ended quietly. Friends speculated Edward had sacrificed happiness for ambition. Only he knew the truth. His heart had never left a girl in Ghana. In 2015, on a business trip to Africa, Edward hired a local investigator to search for Amma. But Ghana was vast, records were missing, and leads were scarce. The detective only shook his head. Mensah is a widespread name. There's no clear trace. Edward returned to England, crushed once more. Even now, he remembered the moment Amma left. No footsteps, No concrete promise, only words on paper, a promise abandoned in a letter, a promise he clung to for 22 years, like a drowning man clutching rotten wood. Then, one December day in 2024, the door opened in the high-rise office of Cavendish Holdings, and a young woman named Grace Mensah walked in. Her eyes, her smile, the tilt of her head instantly pulling Edward back to that memory. The old letter still lay in his desk drawer. Amma had once vowed she would return. She never did, but perhaps she had left a part of herself behind. And Edward understood. It was time to face the truth. In the days following the strange interview, the atmosphere at Cavendish Holdings shifted subtly. For most employees, hiring a young executive assistant was hardly noteworthy. But for Edward Cavendish, the presence of Grace Mensah was like an unfamiliar wind blowing down walls he had spent 20 years building. Grace worked with astonishing speed and precision. She arrived earlier than anyone, prepared meeting materials, and noted down Edward's every word. Within days, she had memorized nearly all of his habits: black tea without sugar at precisely 8 o'clock, his dislike for lavender, and the way he tapped his fingers on the desk when tense. One afternoon, Edward returned from a grueling negotiation, too weary to loosen his tie. A cup of tea on his desk was already brewed to his preferred strength. Surprised, he asked, "I never told you how I take my tea." Grace smiled gently. "I just observed. My mother taught me that to help someone, you must notice the smallest things." Edward froze. Those words, how she emphasized mother with that distinct cadence, brought back a long-ago night in King's College Library, when Amma Mensah once said, "My mother told me knowledge is the one thing no one can take away." His heart wavered. Late one evening, when most staff had gone home, Edward passed by and saw Grace still at her desk, absorbed in data entry. He told her she needn't work so late, but she looked up, eyes bright with determination. "I can't waste this opportunity. Without worrying about this report, I want you to focus on tomorrow's bigger things." Edward sat opposite, studying the young woman carrying the world's weight. After a pause, he asked softly, "Grace, you once said your mother was seriously ill. May I ask, what illness?" Grace hesitated, then sighed. "A car accident when I was very young. She was severely injured and has been in a wheelchair ever since. Still, she never stopped working to put me through school. But in recent years, her health has declined. The doctors say she needs a complex surgery. The cost is far beyond what we can manage." Edward felt as though a hand gripped his heart. The image of Amma, so full of life when he had loved her, now confined to a wheelchair for 2 decades, nearly suffocated him. He steadied his voice as he asked, "Your mother's name?" "Amma Mensah," Grace answered instantly, without hesitation. "She's everything to me." Edward gripped the chair arms to stop his trembling. That name, the one he had whispered in the dark for years, was now spoken by a young woman before him. He pressed further. "And your father?" Grace's eyes clouded. She bit her lip before replying, "My mother never said much. I only know that while she studied here, she loved someone once, but they drifted apart. Whenever I asked more, she stayed silent." A storm rose in Edward's chest. He longed to cry out the truth, to declare that he was that man, that he had searched for Amma for 20 years. But reason restrained him. Not yet. Not without proof. That night, he summoned Margaret Doyle to his office. Handing her a thick envelope containing the old letter Amma had left behind, his voice was low, resolute. "I want you to find everything about Grace Mensah and her mother. Birth records, school history, medical files, addresses, anything. Absolute secrecy." Margaret hesitated, recognizing the gravity. After a pause, she nodded. "This has to do with the woman from the past." Edward did not answer. He turned instead to the window, staring at London's cold, star-like lights. Margaret asked no more, only sighed softly and left. Edward lived in a haze of hope and doubt in the following days. The more he observed Grace, the more she resembled Amma, the furrow of her brow in concentration, the unconscious rhythm of her fingers, the shy smile when praised. Each piece locked into place, forming the portrait of the woman he had once loved. One noon, as they shared a quick meal in his office, Grace suddenly asked, "Mr. Cavendish, have you ever genuinely been in love?" The question stunned him. He thought of Charlotte, the loveless marriage, the fleeting encounters that left only emptiness. He nodded faintly. Yes. Once. And I don't believe there will be a second time. Grace gave a wistful smile. My mother says the same. She told me she loved only one man, even though he's no longer with her. Edward swallowed hard, turning away to hide the tears clouding his eyes. That evening, Margaret returned, placing a thick file on his desk. Her voice was solemn. I found it. Grace's birth certificate leaves the father's name blank. Mother. Amma Mensah, born 1980, 2, Accra, Ghana. Records show she studied at King's College London from 2002 to 2003. That same year, she returned home, was injured in a bus accident, and was left permanently paralyzed. Also that year, she gave birth to a baby girl, Grace. Edward's hands shook as he gripped the file. Each line pierced like a blade. The accident, the disability, the child all unfolding while he had searched in vain. He raised his eyes, blazing with fierce light. Margaret, there is no longer doubt. Grace is my daughter. The next morning, Edward arrived early. Standing by the glass wall, he watched Grace through the partition, carefully arranging files. Her black hair was neatly tied, her slender frame radiating quiet strength. His chest swelled with an emotion he had never known. In that instant, he understood. Before him stood not just a young employee, but the living embodiment of his first love, the blood of his blood, hidden from him by fate for 22 years. He whispered, only to himself, my daughter. Edward Cavendish sat frozen before the file Margaret had just handed him. London roared with horns and hurried lives outside, but in his luxurious office, time seemed to halt. Each page laid bare the truth he had longed for and feared for 22 years. Amma's name appeared plainly, her birth year, address, the accident, and condition. And then Grace, the child born precisely 9 months after their last night together. Edward held the file, his hands drained of strength. He closed his eyes, letting the past pour in like a flood. Amma's hair glinting in the autumn sun, her shy smile in the cafe, her whisper, wait for me. For years, he had only the old letter to convince himself that love had once been real. Now the truth stood before him, merciless in its clarity. When he opened his eyes, Margaret was watching her gaze a mix of worry and compassion. She had worked with him long enough to see the tremors in a man once deemed unshakable. Mr. Cavendish, she said softly, now you know for sure. Edward nodded slowly. His voice was hoarse. Grace is my daughter. He rose and walked to the glass wall, staring at the ant-like streams of cars below. For 22 years, he had built an empire and ascended to the summit of global finance. Yet at this moment, he felt nothing but failure. He had missed his daughter's childhood, her first steps, her school days, her scraped knees, the nights she might have asked, Daddy, tell me a story. Margaret rested her hand on the file, her tone calm but firm. You cannot change the past, but you can decide what to do from now on. Edward stood silent for a long while. At last, his eyes blazed with resolve. I will not lose another second. The next day, Edward summoned Grace to his private office. She entered with a stack of papers, her shy smile as always. He studied her carefully, so familiar, yet so new. Every detail of her face echoed Amma, yet with her distinct spark, a living blend of them both. Sit down, Grace, he said, his voice deliberate. She tilted her head slightly, brown eyes attentive. Edward's heart thundered. He had rehearsed this moment thousands of times, but now the words abandoned him. I need to ask you something, he began hesitantly. When is your birthday? Grace blinked at the personal question, then replied, the 15th of September 2003. Edward inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Precisely as he had calculated. 9 months after that night in his dorm, he and Amma had given themselves completely. His voice sank lower. And your mother? Did she ever tell you about your father? Grace shook her head. Only fragments. She said he was kind, intelligent, and passionate. He would have loved me with all his heart if he had known about me. But she never spoke his name. Edward's throat tightened. He wanted to embrace her, shout that he loved Amma with everything, and that his absence had never been by choice. But he bit down the words. Not yet. If he revealed it too abruptly, it might shatter everything. Grace studied him, puzzled. Mr. Cavendish, why are you asking me these things? Edward drew a long breath, choosing caution. It's just. I once knew someone from Ghana at university. When you mentioned your mother, I remembered her. Grace smiled faintly, wistfully. Then perhaps it was her. But if so, you must understand the effect she had on people. She always left a lasting impression. Edward nodded. Too lasting, so deep that he had never been able to forget. When Grace left with her files, Edward sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He knew he could not delay much longer. The truth was not his alone, it belonged to Grace, Amma, and all the years lost. That day, he instructed Margaret to take the next step. Contact a genetics laboratory. She looked up, hesitant. You want a DNA test? I need official confirmation, Edward said firmly. My heart already knows, but I want proof beyond dispute. Days later, the sealed envelope arrived. Edward held it with trembling hands. For years, he had signed billion-pound contracts without a flicker of doubt, but this single piece of paper nearly unmanned him. At last, he tore it open. His eyes scanned the cold clinical words. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. Numbers are blunt and final, striking like a hammer. The page slipped from his hand. Tears welled tears he had forbidden himself for so long. His voice cracked in a whisper. My daughter. Amma's voice returned in his mind. Wait for me. He had waited, and now he understood she had not returned herself, but she had left him a part of her, a gift, Grace. That night, Edward did not return to his penthouse. Instead, he walked along the Thames, where he and Amma had once sat for hours. The winter wind cut sharply, but inside him burned an unfamiliar warmth. After 22 years, he found the living bond to Amma again, the family he thought forever lost. And he knew the next step was inevitable. He must go to Ghana. He must face Amma. He must tell her everything he had never been able to say. And this time, he would not let another promise be left behind. The Cavendish Holdings private jet touched down on a blazing morning at Kotoka International Airport. Edward Cavendish had sat motionless throughout the flight, his mind torn between hope and fear. For over 20 years, he had never thought to return to Ghana, a distant and hazy land in memory. Yet now, it had become the one destination his heart longed for. The hired car rolled out of Accra. Along red-dusted roads wound through lush villages. The sights on either side made Edward feel like he had entered another world. Fields of banana trees, tin-roofed houses, children running barefoot, and women balancing water pots gracefully. This was Amma's homeland, the soil that had forged the strength he once adored. The driver pointed toward a deep green hillside. Sir, the village of Aburi is just there. The woman you seek lives in a small house near the center. Edward's heart hammered wildly. He clenched his fists, wondering what he would say when he saw Amma again. How could he explain 22 years of absence? How could he face her reproach or worse, her indifference? When the car stopped, a small blue-painted house appeared before him, its tin roof weathered with age. A neat garden of vegetables lay in front, and bright cloths hung drying on the porch. Everything was simple, but tidy and warm. Edward stepped out, his legs heavy as lead. In his hand was a bouquet he had hastily bought in Accra, wild red plantains Amma had once loved. Drawing a deep breath, he climbed the steps and knocked. From inside came a faint rustling, then a voice so familiar it nearly brought him to his knees. Deeper, rougher now, but still hers. Amma Mensah. Who is it? The door isn't locked. Please, come in. Edward pushed gently. The small room was orderly, with shelves of old books, a desk piled with medical files, and pill bottles. At its center stood a wheelchair. Seated upon it, a woman faced away, short hair streaked with grey. Edward stood still, breath caught in his throat. Then, voice trembling, he whispered, Amma. The woman froze, hands halting mid-motion. Slowly, she turned. And in that instant, Edward's world collapsed and was reborn. Before him was Amma, 20 years older, her face lined with hardship, yet her eyes still the same, deep, luminous brown. They widened in shock, then filled with pain. "Edward," her voice cracked. "It can't be." He took a step forward, offering the flowers with shaking hands. "It's me. I came to find you." Amma shook her head, turning away, her voice breaking. "No, you shouldn't be here." Edward dropped to his knees before the wheelchair, locking his gaze with hers. "Amma, I never stopped searching for you. For 20 years I couldn't believe I'd lost you." Tears welled in Amma's eyes. She gripped the chair's arms, trembling. "Why have you come? We ended long ago. You built an entire life in London. A life without you, without our daughter." Edward's voice was low, forged in fire. "Amma, I've met Grace. She works for me." Amma flinched, her eyes wide, breath shallow. "My God. No. She doesn't know, does she?" Edward nodded slowly. "She does now. I had the test. Grace is my daughter." Amma buried her face in her hands and broke into sobs. The sound tore through the little house. Edward longed to hold her, but fear stopped him, fear of breaking the fragile armor she had built around her heart. "Why, Amma?" he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" She raised her tear-stained face. "Because I wouldn't chain you down. After the accident, I wasn't myself anymore. My legs were gone. I became a burden. I didn't want you forced to choose between your brilliant future and a disabled woman in Africa." Edward shook his head, hands clenched tight to contain the trembling. "You thought I needed ambition more than you. Amma, I've had everything, wealth, fame, but I felt the loss every day. You and Grace were all that mattered." Amma's face twisted with anguish. "You don't understand. I raised her alone. I learned to survive without anyone. I am no longer worthy." Edward moved closer, taking her thin hand into his. "You never stopped being worthy. You raised Grace into a remarkable young woman. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Don't you dare call yourself a burden." Amma broke down, her body shaking as tears spilled freely. She both wanted to push him away and collapse into him. Her sobs fell against his shoulder, raw and unguarded. He whispered into her ear, "I'm here now, and this time, I won't leave." Amma bowed her head, her frail shoulders trembling, and they were again in each other's arms for the first time in 22 years. After that tearful reunion, the little house in Aburi fell into silence. Amma sat in her wheelchair, hands clutching a cushion, refusing to meet Edward's eyes. And Edward, though only a few steps away, felt as if thousands of miles separated them. Once, they had been everything to each other, but 22 years had carved a chasm almost impossible to bridge. Edward broke the silence first. He set the flowers down on the table, his voice steady but resolute. "Amma, you think you're no longer worthy. But you're wrong. I loved you when you were that fierce young woman debating the whole class about Ghana's economy, and I love you still today after all the losses I can't even imagine." Amma shook her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "Edward, you don't understand. The accident took my legs, my youth, my dreams. I had to learn to change my baby's diaper while lying helpless in a hospital bed. I thought I would die there, but I survived, and I lived on only for Grace. Each day, I told myself I could endure anything as long as she grew strong." She lifted her gaze, eyes brimming with tears. "But you belong to another world. Skyscrapers, shareholder meetings, glittering galas. And me, I sit here in this small house, volunteering at the local clinic. You come and go, but I must live this reality forever." Edward moved forward, kneeling before her, taking her calloused hands in his. "I don't care about any of that. For 22 years, all that glitter was just a shell. I had money and power, but never wholeness. Only when I saw Grace, when I knew she was ours, did I understand what I had truly lost. And now, seeing you again, I know I cannot return to that old life." Amma closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. She wanted to believe, but fear screamed inside her. She had built high walls around her heart for years to shield herself from a longing she dared not touch. Now Edward was breaking them down, and she feared she would shatter again. "You don't know, Edward," she whispered hoarsely. There were nights I watched Grace sleep and wept in silence. When she asked where her father was, I invented stories about a good man far away. I taught her to love a shadow, while the truth was I had hidden your name. I thought it was right, but now I don't know anymore. Edward brushed away her tears, his voice trembling yet firm. You did everything you could. You raised Grace into an extraordinary young woman. You owe no apology. Amma, you are not at fault. The one at fault is me, for not finding you sooner. Amma met his eyes. She saw not only love but guilt eating away at him in them. She whispered, "Would you still have chosen me if you knew what I became?" Edward did not hesitate. "I choose you yesterday, today, and always." Amma broke into sobs. This time her tears were not only of pain, but of a fragile hope flickering to life. Yet reason pulled her back. "Edward, you've only just found me again. This feeling might be an illusion of the past. One day, when pity fades, you'll see you were mistaken." Edward tightened his grip on her hands, his voice like steel. "This is not pity. This is love that has waited more than 20 years. Do you think anyone could pretend to remember every tilt of your head, every sound of your laughter, for so long?" Amma trembled. She wanted to refute him, but no words came. Deep down, she still loved him, had never stopped, but fear strangled her voice. Edward stood and walked to the small window. Outside, village children played, their laughter ringing clear. He turned back, eyes resolute. "Amma, I didn't come here to take away your life. I came to share it. You've carried too much for too long. Let me stand beside you. Let us be a family." Amma bowed her head, her hand pressed to her chest as though to still her racing heart. She whispered, broken, "I don't know if I dare to love again." Edward stepped close, his hand resting gently yet firmly on her shoulder. "Then let me have enough courage for both of us." Amma looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, the wall she had built for 20 years began to crack. The afternoon in Aburi blazed with slanting sunlight. Amma's little house was heavy with silence after the long, fraught conversation. Edward sat at the table's edge, head bowed, while Amma turned her back to him, gazing out the window at children playing football on the red earth. Both were lost in their thoughts, and their distance felt like an unbridgeable abyss. Then came the sound of a suitcase rolling across the porch. The door swung open, and a familiar voice rang out, firm, "Mother, I know he's here too." Amma spun around, face paling. Edward shot to his feet, startled. Standing in the doorway was Grace, her brown eyes ablaze, her face weary from the long flight, yet lit with resolve. She dropped her suitcase onto the floor and looked at her parents as if she had waited her whole life for this moment. "I quit my job," Grace declared, each word sharp. "I couldn't stay in London while the two of you tortured yourselves here with half-buried memories." Amma faltered, her voice trembling. You shouldn't have come. You need that job." "Jobs can be replaced," Grace said firmly, stepping closer, her gaze drilling into her mother's. "But the family can't. I grew up in absence, in half-told stories, in your faraway stares. I can't bear it any longer." Amma bit her lip, tears shimmering. Edward stood speechless, staring at his daughter like she was the last bridge left to cross. Grace turned to him. "And you, Father, you found us after 20 years, but you're still hesitating, just standing there. You love each other, that's obvious. Yet both of you let fear and pride bury it." She paused, drawing a shuddering breath before pressing on, her voice breaking yet fierce. "I've heard Mother cry at night, whispering your name, thinking I didn't notice. I've seen her keep that old letter in her drawer, stroking it like a treasure. I grew up with the shadow of a man I had never met, yet I learned to love him through every word she spoke. And when I finally met you, I knew she was right. You are that man. You have always loved her, even when you were apart." Amma covered her mouth, tears spilling uncontrollably. Edward trembled, his throat too tight to speak, until he managed only, "Grace, don't speak." Grace cut him off, eyes blazing. "You command an empire and thousands of employees, yet you lack the courage to tell her you still love her. And you, Mother, you sit here convincing yourself you're unworthy. Do you know how angry that makes me? 22 years, I lost a father, and you lost the love of your life. Why did you both let fear dictate everything? The room fell silent but for Grace's heavy breathing. She moved to her mother's wheelchair, knelt, and clasped Amma's hand. Mother, you taught me that love is action, not just words. You told me family means never giving up on each other. So now, do you have the courage to live by what you taught me? Amma gazed at her daughter, tears streaming, and deep in her eyes, the wall she had built for decades began to crumble. Grace turned to Edward, her tone gentler yet no less resolute. Father, you found us. Don't let us slip away again. If you genuinely love her, prove it. Edward stepped forward slowly, standing before them both. He looked at Amma, then at Grace, his chest ready to burst. His daughter's words stripped away the armor he had worn for 20 years. I love you, Amma, Edward said, his voice raw but steady. I never stopped. I've lived in emptiness too long and cannot endure one more day. I'm not afraid. The only thing I fear is losing you again. Amma broke down, covering her face as sobs racked her body. Grace squeezed her hand, whispering, Mother, please don't deny this happiness any longer. Edward bent down, gently pulling Amma's hands away from her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but the resistance in her eyes had faded. He whispered, Let me be by your side. Let us be a family for Grace and for us. Amma trembled, her lips moving soundlessly, finally giving the slightest nod. The room seemed to brighten. Grace exhaled in relief and threw her arms around her mother. Edward knelt beside them, wrapping them both in his arms, feeling the warmth of the family he had dreamed of for 20 years. In that moment, fear dissolved. All that remained were three souls clinging tightly together, letting love and blood erase 2 decades of separation. Night in Aburi was so still that one could hear crickets in the garden and the wind brushing across the tin roof. The little house glowed with lamplight, its warm golden hue falling over 3 figures seated around an old wooden table: Amma, Edward, and Grace. After the emotional storm of the afternoon, none spoke. Only the clink of a spoon against a teacup and the faint sighs broke the silence. Grace was the first to speak. She looked at her father, then her mother, her eyes stern yet full of hope. You can't stop here. If you genuinely love each other, you must move forward. Amma clutched her daughter's hand, her voice trembling. You don't understand, Grace. Between your father and me, there are too many wounds. Grace shook her head. That's precisely why you need healing. And the only way is to be together. Edward sat silently, his hands trembling beneath the table. For days, he had carried something small yet heavy as the world. Looking into his daughter's eyes, then at the woman before him, her face lined with years, yet still the one he loved, he knew he could wait no longer. He rose, walked to his suitcase in the corner, and returned holding a deep blue velvet box. Opening it, the lamplight caught the simple, pure diamond within. Amma's eyes widened. Grace raised her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Edward knelt before Amma's wheelchair, his hand shaking but his gaze unwavering. Amma Mensah, he said hoarsely, I bought this ring more than 20 years ago. I planned to give it to you that summer, but you left, leaving only a letter promising you would return. I have kept it with me ever since. He paused, drew a deep breath, then continued. Every day I thought of you, of that unfinished promise. I never knew what you endured, how you raised our child alone. But I know one thing, my love never changed. Amma, today I want to ask you the question I should have asked 22 years ago. Will you marry me? Amma was stunned, her lips trembling soundlessly. She looked at the ring, then at Edward kneeling before her. Memories surged. Afternoons in the library, snowy nights, the whispered vow, we'll find a way. She had buried them under dust and years, but now they returned vivid and alive. Edward, she whispered, tears flowing. You don't understand. I'm no longer that girl. I'm crippled. I'm old. I've lost everything. Edward shook his head, his voice firm as steel. You've lost nothing. You raised an extraordinary daughter. You lived bravely and kindly, even when the world was cruel. I see you, Amma, not your legs, not your pain, but who you are. Strong, beautiful, still the woman I love. Grace knelt beside her mother, gripping her hand, her own voice breaking. Mother, Please don't turn away from your happiness. I've never seen you truly smile all these years. But when Father spoke those words, I saw the light return to your eyes. Please don't let it fade. Amma shook, tears pouring, but her gaze slowly changed from fear to yearning to courage. She looked at Edward, and for the first time in over 2 decades, allowed herself to believe in another future. Perhaps, she whispered, perhaps it's time I stopped running. Edward's heart pounded as if it would burst. He waited. Amma drew a long breath, then said clearly, firmly, "Yes, Edward, I will." In that moment, the room seemed to flood with light. Edward slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands trembling. Though her fingers were thin and worn from years of toil, the ring fit perfectly as though it had waited all this time for this very moment. Grace burst into tears, throwing her arms around her mother and then her father. Edward and Amma met each other's eyes over their daughter's shoulder, their smiles radiant through tears. The three held each other tightly, sealing the end of 2 decades of separation. Outside, a crescent moon rose over the hills, casting a silver glow upon the old tin roof. The village of Aburi lay peaceful, but inside the little house, a family had been reborn. News of the upcoming wedding between Edward Cavendish and Amma Mensah spread quickly through Aburi. The villagers, long accustomed to Amma, the woman in a wheelchair who never stopped giving to her community, were deeply moved to hear that she was to wed the man who had crossed half the world to find her again. Mothers brought vegetables as gifts, and children ran about, cheering. No one saw it as strange, but rather as a long-awaited miracle. Edward poured his heart into the preparations. He wanted no grand London-style ceremony, but a simple, heartfelt celebration in the village that had witnessed Amma's struggles. Within days, with the entire community's help, Aburi's small square bloomed with paper garlands, palm leaves, and strips of brilliant kente cloth. The villagers cooked together. Drums and songs rang through the air. On the wedding day, Amma wore a blue kente dress, threaded with gold and sewn from fabric Edward had bought her at the market days earlier. She sat in a new wheelchair Edward had brought from London, lighter and sturdier than her old one. Beside her, Grace wore a simple white gown, her braids neat, and at once she was the daughter, bridesmaid, and the bride who had brought her parents together again. Edward approached in a traditional Ghanaian dashiki paired with light trousers. He was no longer the cold executive of London's glass towers, but a man trembling with joy. When he clasped Amma's thin yet warm hand, he felt as though he had returned to 21, standing in a lecture hall at King's College, seeing the Ghanaian girl for the first time. The officiant, a village elder, spoke in a resounding voice. "Today, we witness a wedding and love's triumph over time, distance, and adversity." Edward knelt beside Amma's wheelchair, holding her hand, looking into her eyes. "Amma, more than 20 years ago, we promised to find a way. Today, I want to keep that promise. I choose you not because you are perfect, but because you are you. And I vow that from this day forward, you will never have to fight alone again." Amma's tears flowed, but her smile shone bright. "Edward, I once thought I had lost everything and had nothing to give you, but you proved me wrong. You've shown me love is not measured by how far our legs can carry us, but by how much our hearts can endure. Today, I choose you to walk with you on the road ahead, however we may travel it." The drums thundered, the village cheered, and happy tears glistened everywhere. Edward bent and kissed Amma tenderly. In that moment, 22 years of separation vanished, leaving only a radiant present. The celebration lasted deep into the night. Villagers danced and sang around a bonfire. Grace sat between her parents, watching the scene with a heart overflowing. She had once longed for a complete family, and now, the impossible had become real. After the ceremony, Edward led Amma to the porch. The moon shone brilliantly, casting its shadow on the red earth. He took her hand, speaking softly. "Tomorrow, we return to London. Everything is arranged. The best doctors will take care of you." Amma smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "This time, I won't leave." Grace stepped out, wrapping her arms around them both, whispering, "We are a family now." And at that moment, beneath the Ghanaian moonlight, 3 people who had once been lost to each other finally found their homes.